Even as the stakes for succeeding in education get higher and higher every year, we're still choosing a mode of teaching that we know only works well for a minority of our children, and it's killing us. It's time to start talking about the most revolutionary option on the table: unleashing our superpower.
Nothing, absolutely nothing, approaches the effectiveness of tutoring.
It would be really hard to find an educational intervention that has the same rigorous research base and potential to improve student outcomes as tutoring does.
Tutoring, lots and lots of tutoring. That is going to put them way, way ahead.
I'm Giles Leeper. Welcome to Tutoring, the Human Superpower.
My main vivid memory was coming into your office, I think at the end of the first day, and just giving you like a massive high five of like, oh my gosh, like this is really happening after so many years of trying, and just staring in disbelief at each other that we have opened the Kindezi School. It was such a cool moment.
That's the voice of Kathleen Jones. Back in 2010, she and I co-founded a school in Atlanta that still exists today. In fact, now it's a network of 3 schools. We worked together closely for about 4 years to get a charter school up and running, the Kindezi School. I became the school's principal and she became a teacher. And so although we shared an important experience, our experiences of it were from very different perspectives: principal versus teacher. And since leaving Kindezi, I've done a lot more research into tutoring, which I initially saw as the bedrock of our model, but I didn't really understand the science of it. As you know, if you've listened to other episodes of this podcast, I've come to see it as a major human superpower. The way that humans are naturally really good at teaching and learning, connecting, and building one another up all at the same time. And so as I spoke with Kathleen Jones, co-founder of the Kindezi School and teacher there, a major question I had for her was how much did her experience of tutoring at the Kindezi School align with the science and the psychology of tutoring? Were we unleashing our superpower at Kindezi? Is it even possible to unleash our superpower in a charter school right now? Like hypothetically, if you wanted to, could you go and start a school somewhere today that could even begin to unleash our superpower? In other words, could you begin to make the superior power of tutoring into a right for children of all backgrounds, rather than a privilege for children born to more resources? Radical and massive paradigm shifts have happened before in education, but they take a long time. Still, I think it's interesting to ask, what could we do right now? Even though these paradigm shifts inevitably take us to places that will surprise us, and it's impossible for us to know where they're going at the start of them, they still have to start somewhere. And so as I spoke with Kathleen, I wanted to know, did we do something that could be considered the beginning of a paradigm shift? Everything we did is something that just about anybody could have done, or still can do now. So in a sense, I'm examining the question in this interview: is any individual right now in a position to begin to unleash our superpower? So even that first day, did you feel like it was different from teaching elsewhere in your past experiences?
100%. I was just much less stressed and nervous. I mean, just the sheer reality of having 6 kids in front of me or in my charge at a time was just way less stressful. I mean, there's always, when I taught, the first day was a mixture of nervousness and excitement, but with the first day at Kindezi, it was way more excitement than nervousness. And you felt like you got to know the kids so much more quickly, of course, because there are fewer of them.
Like every other teacher at the Kindezi School that day, on the first day of school, Kathleen found herself in charge of teaching just 6 students. Okay, let me back up and give you a little more context here. So here's the basic setup of the Kindezi School. It was a charter school. It still is. And this means that we got about the same amount of money per student as the public schools. We had to admit every student, and if there were too many applications for the spots that we had available, which there always were, we had to select the students who would actually get in via a random lottery. And we were granted permission to run this school how we wanted to run it by Atlanta Public Schools. And the most distinctive thing that we wanted to do differently was that we wanted to have just 6 students in every class. But we were running the school out of a traditional public school building, and one classroom was just way too much space for 6 students and 1 teacher. So we had to get a little creative.
My co-teacher and I had our classroom all set up, divided into 2 spaces-ish with a little classroom library in the middle. So we had 2 groups of 6 in our room. One group was technically my homeroom, and the other group was technically her homeroom. I taught language arts and social studies twice throughout the day, and she taught math and science to both groups of 6 as well. So we would have 2 major blocks of instruction that were multiple hours long.
So in that first year, there were 96 kindergarten through 2nd grade students, 16 teachers, and 8 rooms. The rooms were split down the middle, normally with bookcases, because I did not want team teaching. 2 teachers tag teaming with 12 kids is not conducive to our superpower. Here's Stanford's Carly Robinson, who was a leading expert on the scientific evidence on tutoring.
Tutoring can mean, one-on-one instruction or up to, 3 or 4 students in a session, but any more students at one time, and it's not really tutoring anymore.
I specifically wanted to see groups of 3, maybe 4 or fewer students when I peeked into the classrooms, because that's actually tutoring. And in the beginning, I was very clear with myself, at least, that I didn't care about just small classes. I cared about tutoring. The word Kindezi is a Congolese word that means babysitting. But as I read the book called Kindezi, the Congo Art of Babysitting, I realized that their word for babysitting was synonymous with formal and informal tutoring, at least to me. In the beginning, the Kindezi School meant the tutoring school.
I felt really confident from the very beginning in the idea of individualized instruction and tutorial. Like that felt natural and right and good from the beginning. Because when I first met you, I remember teaching at the same time and having experiences where I would pull a group of 3 or 4 kids to do some additional instruction. And I absolutely loved those moments. And I hated all the whole group direct instruction stuff. And so I knew that I was really going to like that. And I did from the very beginning, and it felt effective from the beginning, even if I couldn't have articulated exactly why.
When we met, she was teaching in a more traditionally structured charter school. And so when she pulled groups of 3 and 4 students, that felt better compared to teaching, 20 to 24 kids. But the science says that actually tutoring 3 kids should feel quite different from teaching 6 kids too. One question I have for you as a teacher is just, did teaching 6 feel meaningfully different to you compared to teaching 3?
Yeah. Sometimes it was 2 students in a group, do a 4 and a 2, sometimes do 3 2s, and sometimes I would do 2 3s. And I remember that in the rare moments when I would tutor a group of 4 versus 1, 2, or 3. Yeah, I felt that scale tip. It didn't feel as natural. It didn't feel as relaxed. And here's the other thing, like even with a group of 6, as the numbers climb, a much larger portion of my cognitive load as a teacher is spent on classroom management, managing student dynamics. So instead of assessing, am I seeing the light bulbs going on, instead of doing the mind reading around cognition, I'm doing mind reading around, okay, this kid is now disengaged. This kid needs to move because they're distracting this other kid, and I'm still trying to get my point across effectively and be engaging, but I am also spending a lot of effort thinking about how to simply keep them engaged. Whereas if it's me and 2 kids and I am sitting across a small table from them, less than 2 feet away, staring them in the eyeballs, it typically was so much easier.
So one of the things that popped up for Kathleen when I asked her this question was around classroom management or discipline. The Kindezi School had a 74% free and reduced lunch rate that year, which is sort of an indicator of socioeconomic status. Generally, schools with higher free and reduced lunch rates have more disciplinary problems. But according to the research, kids who are being tutored should not have as many disciplinary issues while they're being tutored. If we were truly using our superpower, we should not have experienced as many disciplinary issues. Even in that first year, do you remember whether there were differences in behavior during tutoring time versus the times when kids were not actively being tutored?
I never once had to call for backup, so to speak, because of a kid acting out in my tutorial group. Absolutely not. It was always during the whole group instructional, direct instruction time, I had a hard time managing, and then larger, less structured times were harder. The very most common scenario was lunch and recess,
Yeah.
always. And I think that's universal. The larger the group and the less supervision there was, the more
Yeah.
issues you had.
To give teachers a break, we would send kids to lunch and to recess with as few teachers as possible, often just one teacher for 24 students. And during those periods, we had a lot of disciplinary problems. Fights, ignoring teachers, bad words. A lot of my job as principal in the first year was just dealing with the aftermath of lunch and recess.
And it was from me watching you go through that from the outside, that was hard to watch. And at times it felt like it was a relatively small number of kids that were spending a whole lot of time with you, and
Yeah.
you were puzzling over what to do and how to support them.
Yeah, and I'm pretty sure I remember correctly that some of those kids were also in your class. It wasn't the toughest class in the school, but you did have some of the tricky ones. How were they when you were tutoring them?
Yeah, there were a few, especially if I look over the 5 years, there were definitely some. And I actually loved having those particular kids with me during tutorial time because that's when I felt like it was easiest to capture and keep their attention. When they were off doing something in another area of the classroom, I had very little confidence that what they were doing was exactly what they should be doing.
Yeah.
But yeah, tutorial time with kids who struggled, there was something about my physical proximity to them and the urgency that I could communicate non-verbally that made a huge difference. When a person, I won't even say a kid, when a person sees that your entire spotlight of attention as the instructor is trained on them, it is a game changer. It is fundamentally different than if they are sitting in a larger group. And I don't think it's simply because I don't think it's that they felt scared of me or nervous that I was giving them all this attention. There is just like a sense of focus, concentration that you can communicate in a tutorial setting that is much harder to do in a whole group setting.
One of the things we should see if we're using our superpower is teachers' scaffolding. The very specific kind of scaffolding that we learned about in episode 2 on this podcast. Teachers should be seen offering individual kids just enough support for them to be able to do challenging things that they couldn't have done for themselves. It can be emotional support, it can look like hints or suggestions, or it can just look like sitting back and letting the kids struggle with something for a minute on their own. Just to be clear though, scaffolding is not a word that I ever used back then. I only learned about its special relationship to tutoring after I left Kindezi, when I began to dive deeper into the psychology of tutoring. But scaffolding is supposed to be something that we do naturally. It shouldn't matter whether the principal of the school is telling teachers to scaffold or not. I explained to my co-founder Kathleen what I meant by scaffolding, and then I asked her this question. Do you remember using scaffolding during your tutoring time back then?
Oh, yeah. I mean, scaffolding and the immediate feedback were the hallmarks of what made it so different. And those are one and the same, really. I mean, being able to watch what a kid is doing or listen to how a kid is reading, and sometimes choose to let them work it out, struggle it out because you know they can get there. And other times it feels like a bit of a bridge too far. So then you offer a little bit of guidance or you ask a question that's going to lead them to where they need to go so that they maintain that sense of flow and success in what they're doing. I find myself, as I reflect on the early years, thinking a lot about stress levels, and that scaffolding enabled student stress levels to be lower because they felt successful and they also knew they had that support if they needed it.
Oh, interesting. That's an interesting connection between scaffolding and stress levels. Did it also feel like scaffolding was less stressful for teachers?
Yeah, having tutoring be kind of a bedrock or a mainstay of our model, I immediately think of just like generally lower stress levels for both students and teacher because the teacher is getting and giving immediate feedback from students. It's relatively natural process. It's relatively easy once you get into the groove, and there's not a ton of overhead in terms of work spent outside of the instructional hours.
So, how did your scaffolding actually look during your tutoring sessions?
Scaffolding on my end ended up sounding very conversational, very we're talking, I am trying to hit all the standards, but it flows in terms of like, oh my gosh, can you believe she did this? And at the beginning, this character was like this, and now she's this, and we're just having a book club meeting. It's what it feels like. The scaffolding, the standards-based instruction, it can all kind of work its way into the tutorial that way. So scaffolding was a huge and very natural part of the tutoring process. And I think it's something that is easier than some other skills that we expect teachers to learn.
So, after talking to Kathleen, it does seem a bit like our superpower was a part of the Kindezi School. Scaffolding, mind reading, immediate feedback, individualization. These are themes that come up if you look into the psychology of why tutoring works so much better than any other instructional approach that is not tutoring. Also, Kathleen used the words relaxed and natural a lot, which makes sense because when kids and teachers use their superpower, it should feel somewhat natural. Like something humans have been doing since the beginning of humanity. Which it is. It should feel less stressful both to teachers and to students. And so, as I talked to her, I was starting to feel good. Like, gee, maybe we did really begin to unleash our superpower at the Kindezi School. Until I asked this question. How many hours of tutoring per day do you think each student got in your class?
So 30 to 45 minutes a day? For me, they get the same amount over there. And so if you double that, an hour to an hour and a half a day of tutorial time with the teacher.
Yeah. When the teacher has the group of 6 all together, that's not tutoring. When kids are working independently while the teacher is tutoring other kids, that's not tutoring for them. Lunch, recess, specials, social studies, science, none of those were tutoring. She's saying that if we added up all the time that kids spent learning in groups of 4 or fewer, then it would add up to 1 hour to an hour and a half of tutoring per day between her and the teacher who shared her room with her. Split 60 to 90 minutes into math, reading, and writing, and it just doesn't amount to that much. To be honest, that was a little hard for me to hear. I had been estimating more per day, more like 2.5 hours, which also kind of doesn't amount to that much when I compare it to what we had to sacrifice to make that possible. And I'll come back to that. But for now, I'll just say that if you're trying to have such small classes on a public school budget as 6 students per class, there are trade-offs. So that's what we accomplished with reducing our class sizes to 6 and trying to split the kids into tutoring groups as much as possible. Although I did write the word tutoring 35 times into our application to become a charter school, and it was my entire justification for having small classes. And even though I did walk into every classroom every day to make sure that some tutoring was happening, that's what we achieved, about an hour to an hour and a half a day of tutoring. And let me be honest, this tutoring did not include the tutoring privileges that I give my own children. If my children want to learn an instrument, I set them up with a tutor who specializes in that instrument. And then they have my daily focused scaffolding during practice sessions. If my kids need mental health counseling, I hook them up with a licensed therapist, which is just a form of mental health tutoring. If they want to make a Halloween costume, I'm there to scaffold so they can make their wildest creative visions come to life. The kids at Kindezi were tutored in reading, writing, and math. Anything beyond that depended on the resources of their families. And a lot of schools offer at least some tutoring in those specific subjects. Nevertheless, Kathleen does consider the Kindezi School in those early years to be an outlier.
If you look at the full spectrum of like public school offerings, I'd still put us more toward the tutorial school direction. We were an outlier.
And I think she put it right. I think that's the right way to see it. We were on the same spectrum as the other schools. Not something fundamentally different, not beyond a tipping point into a different paradigm altogether, but still we were an outlier in the tutoring school direction in those years. And also our student outcomes were unusual. Based on all the research on tutoring I've been able to find, we would expect to see a school that was an outlier in the tutoring school direction to also be an outlier in terms of both academic performance and also social and emotional growth of students. And I can say with confidence that we were both of those. First, let's talk about social and emotional growth. Discipline became less and less of a problem every year. We grew every year. We added more grades and we added more students. By year 3, we had 50% more students than we did in the first year. But even though we had 50% more students, discipline in our third year was far less of a problem than it was in our first year. In fact, according to the discipline records that I kept, we only had a quarter of the disciplinary incidents in year 3 that we did in the first year. By the way, we kept our high free and reduced lunch rates over those years. Could it be that the scaffolding, the conversations, the sense of connection, the growing confidence, these things that we know from other episodes that tutoring can directly cause, could it be that the 60 to 90 minutes each day of tutoring was having an impact on each child, which then impacted the entire culture of our school? Is it plausible? This is not some magical effect of charter schools, because plenty of charter schools did not experience a reduction in their disciplinary problems from year to year like we did. That was unusual. And also, our academic results were unusual. Compared to our first year, our test scores in year 3 had gone up a whole standard deviation. In non-nerd speak, it means that we went from being below the national average to being well above it in our test scores. In fact, in our third year, we began to outperform 80% of the schools in America. And for a school with a high poverty population that was below average 3 years prior, it was a pretty serious accomplishment. And it got us some attention too, both good and bad. We started getting significant attention from the foundation community of Atlanta. But also, we were investigated for cheating on the standardized tests because our results were so good that they were considered statistically unlikely. But the investigation, of course, found no evidence of cheating. For context, most of the charter schools like us, the ones in high poverty areas that were not affiliated with some major organization or like a national charter school organization, they didn't make it. They were shut down for poor performance. We were a rare success story. And the moment I stopped emphasizing tutoring, our test scores began to plummet. Yes, for reasons that I am still coming to terms with, we completely lost our original mission. And we started to move in a more conventional, non-tutoring direction. And even though this had an immediate consequence of increasing our disciplinary problems and lowering our test scores, I, as the leader, kept us on this new, more conventional path. That moment when kids and teachers were able to use their superpower at the Kindezi School for an hour to an hour and a half a day was both beautiful and very fragile. And it was fragile for many reasons. The most obvious was just financial. In order to make it work to have 6 students in a class on a public school budget, we had to make huge sacrifices elsewhere. Remember, we Atlantans spend nearly 20% of our money on healthcare. But we spend less than 4% of our money on public schools. Like every other city in the country, we're still acting like it's the 20th century. So with 6 students per class, nobody was making a very decent salary. Also, we just couldn't afford those positions that schools need. Like, we didn't have a school nurse, no librarian, sports coaches, special ed staff, vice principal, curriculum leaders. We didn't have any of that. We had a principal, an operations manager, office manager, and teachers. That was it. And every one of those people was underpaid. That reality makes a place fragile. It was also fragile because tutoring is countercultural. None of our teachers have been trained in the importance of tutoring. Nobody talks about our superpower in schools of education. The teachers we were hiring were joining Kindezi with all kinds of ideas and preparation for teaching in a way that did not emphasize the importance of tutoring. Parents didn't grow up with that, and they didn't expect it either. There was not a universal commitment to tutoring within our school community. A lot depended on me as the principal. And I have to admit that my own passion for tutoring was not grounded in science and a deep understanding of what tutoring is. That also made it fragile. My leadership was rooted too much in hunches and feelings instead of undeniable and uncontroversial facts. And because so much depended on my whims, and because I was so whimsical, the moment was fleeting. It was magical, and then it was gone. The Kindezi schools struggled in my last years of leadership there, but they have rebounded under new leadership, and they are still going strong. I am incredibly grateful and proud of the accomplishments of the people who are still there. It is at a different point on the spectrum today, but it's a more realistic point. It's a less fragile point. Not as much tutoring happens per student, but tutoring was only my interpretation of the word Kindezi. Others have made their own meaning of it, and theirs is certainly no less valid or important than mine. So let's come back to that question that I mentioned at the top of the episode. How possible is it for you and me to begin to unleash our superpower within modern constraints, like right now? Are you, for example, in a position to unleash our superpower? My answer is no, but also yes. At the end of the day, all we did was start a charter school. Supporters of charter schools claim that they harken back to an old time when there was far more local autonomy and people could school their own kids how they wanted to. And there's some truth to that, but that's not exactly what this was. This was a guy with an idea, and then a team of 2 people with an idea, me and Kathleen. And then we were trying to bring other people along with us. The first common schools were born of entire communities, not just a few individuals. That's how they found the money to do what they envisioned. It was their money. The common schools movement wasn't a fragile movement because it never depended on one single person. And the same is true for the high school movement a century later. Everything that made this moment at the Kindezi School fragile came back to the same root problem. And that is this. Historically, this is not how really important change happens in American education. When the most exciting revolutions of all time took place, they were community-driven. I'm not claiming that it was all by consensus or even always benevolent. It was a very messy business. Racism, sexism, classism played a role at every turn. And yet, they still managed to create exciting and powerful paradigm shifts that ended up transforming the future beyond what they could possibly have imagined. And the strength of it lay in the widespread grassroots support for these movements. The Kindezi School was a unique school, and it gave me a glimpse into the incredible potential of our superpower. But to call it a paradigm shift is a bit of a stretch. I think it was a variation of the 20th century school model, only with significantly more tutoring. We were an outlier on the spectrum, but we were on the same spectrum with all the other schools. The same school system that today is producing good results for only 20% of children. A paradigm shift happens when there's broad recognition in a community that educational privileges that parents have historically been in charge of providing have become an indispensable part of what a child needs to succeed in the new level of complexity. That unless we take action as communities, many children in our communities will not get what they need, and that our whole society and our whole future will be worse unless we come together and act. And in that sense, you are in a position to change the future. The plural you. If you are a part of a community that is ready to step up for a third time and do that for the sake of our superpower or free high-quality daycare or anything else that we know is an important part of succeeding in our communities, then there's nothing that could stop you. The plural you. Y'all. Really, I'm trying to say y'all. Y'all is the word we use down here. If y'all are part of a community that is ready to step up, I'm just gonna stick with you. Thanks for listening. And this will be the last episode of season 1. Although I do have a backlog of interviews that I have not yet turned into episodes, I'm just taking a break to launch a new nonprofit called The Superpower. Until next time, you can reach me at gilesleeper.com.